The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television. Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernie or Bust Show. We're going to wrap up some details from yesterday, and then we're going to leap into Joe Biden's incomparable incompetence.
You think about Wisconsin, you think about Michigan, I think about Pennsylvania. If Bernie Sanders is not the nominee, where do his supporters go? Do they stay home? Do they vote for Joe Biden? Or do they vote for Donald Trump? What have you found out?
Well, look, there's a bright political scientist at Tufts named Brian Schaffner who did a study on this using a thing called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. It's a survey put together by YouGov and Harvard, and it involves 50,000 in interviews. Now, their suspicion is that 7%, I've seen other numbers of 8% of Bernie Sanders' primary voter supporters in 2016 turned around and voted for Donald Trump in the general election. Now, let's take a look at these three states. In Wisconsin, Bernie Sanders got 568,000 votes in the primary. 7% of that is 40,000, and Donald Trump won the state by about 22. Michigan, 595,000 in the primary. 7% of that is 42,000. Donald Trump won the state by just over 11,000. In Pennsylvania, 720,000 votes for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. 50,000 is 7% of that. Donald Trump won the state by 44,000. So you could make the argument that Donald Trump's winning margin in these states came from people who in the primary had voted for Bernie Sanders.
Well,
it might have been trade.
Very interesting. Keep going. Might have been trade.
Yeah, might have been trade. Yeah, it might have been trade. It might have been that he was the outsider. It might have been that they didn't like Hillary Clinton, and it might have also been a deliberate decision of I'm on the far left of the Democratic Party, and I would rather have Trump there because after Trump it's going to be us than to allow Clinton and solidify the hold on.
The other pundits on the left have not been saying this until Crystal broke from the pack. She's getting a shitstorm of criticism on Twitter and on other places, Facebook too, for saying that we shouldn't allow the Democratic Party to assume that Bernie supporters are going to vote for their anointed corporatist sock puppet. Crystal also is telling us to leave the president line blank and then vote down ballot. This is causing the vote blue no matter who crowd on Twitter to lose their shit.
But Crystal, I got to ask, what's our alternative? I mean, I don't think it's tenable for progressives to threaten to vote for Trump. I think that's nuts. I would never do that.
I would never vote for Donald Trump either, but you can leave it blank. As of today, I'm an undecided voter because here's the thing, Jake. Donald Trump is awful. The next Republican will be awful. And if they always can say, look, you've got to vote for us no matter what, you've got no other choice, then they're always going to treat us like this because you have no power in that situation if you're just going to show up and vote for them anyway. So I know people aren't going to want to hear that, but I think that is the reality of the situation that we face right now.
So this is Ron DOV's reaction. Here we go. Crystal Ball saying she will leave it blank in November. What an absolute hack. Ron, what an absolute sycophantic suck-up of the oligarchy you are. The comments underneath run the gamut from people who are stocking up on toilet paper scared to other people who are like, of course, Crystal, you're saying exactly the right thing. Crystal knew that she would be walking into something when she finally came out and said this. What you have here, if you're looking at the two of them, you've got a sheepdog on one side and a true progressive on the other side. Now, it's possible Crystal could turn out to be a sheepdog too if she tells us in the end to vote for Biden. But Bernie's a sheepdog. He told us to vote for Hillary. He says he's going to vote for Biden, so we can't rely on him for direction. Right now, there's no one out in front whose voice is loud enough for all of us to hear it, who's telling us not to vote for the corporate candidate in the general election other than Crystal. Crystal routinely gets interviews on CNN and MSNBC where she used to work before she was fired. So maybe this is a harbinger of the tide turning. Maybe we're finally to the point where the dam breaks and there are enough voices who are loud enough to be heard, leading the rest of us, leading the charge, telling us not to vote blue no matter who, telling us not to give up our leverage and our inherent power. Here's an article from The Guardian by Ankita Rao. Bernie or bust, the Sanders fans who will never vote for Biden. Ekene Okonkwo studies political science, advocates for gun control and reproductive rights, and is voting in a presidential election for the first time this year, but only if she can vote for Bernie Sanders. The 19-year-old, who studies political science and lives in the Bronx, said the Vermont senator is the only candidate she trusts to deal with the issues she cares most about. On climate change, for instance, she called former Vice President Joe Biden's plan unfeasible. A vote for Biden, who is likely to be the Democratic nominee in November, would only give the party more reason to take her vote for granted, she said. If we lose to Trump, then hopefully within the next 4 years, maybe an AOC or Rashida Tlaib would be able to run, Okonkwo said, referring to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and another progressive politician who has gained popularity in the last 2 years. Maybe there would be a better chance to save the planet. Okonkwo is not alone in her unequivocal and uncompromising support for Sanders. She is part of a loosely connected but vocal group, sometimes uniting under hashtags like Bernie or Bust or Never Biden, who say they will not vote for Biden if he wins the nomination. While it's nearly impossible to know how large the group is, hundreds of people have shared this sentiment, including progressive political candidates. Hundreds, eh? No, it's safe to say there are more than hundreds. There are approximately 1.5 million Bernie or Trump voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania that all alone can make sure that we have to listen to them. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. There are millions of people left over from the 2016 elections that will guarantee you're not going to get Biden. It's cute, though, how you try to minimize the movement. It may be impossible to quantify their number, but not their influence. Those Democrats who will not yield to a moderate and vote for Biden if he wins the nomination are the same group who are sometimes blamed for Donald Trump's victory in 2016 when disappointed Sanders fans sat out the general election. Not to mention that 1.5 million who voted directly for Donald Trump in the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And the past few weeks have been hard to swallow for Sanders fans. After a strong early showing in Iowa, Nevada, and New Hampshire, his star faded on Super Tuesday. Supporters were left disappointed again this week when he lost to Biden in Michigan, where he edged out Hillary Clinton in 2016. As the Sanders campaign reckons with the fallout and former Democratic candidates rush to endorse Biden, the Bernie or Bust fans are grappling with a repeat of 2016. It's hard to tell how their decision could affect the election, but in 2016, a similar group of people who boycotted Hillary Clinton on Election Day contributed to her loss in swing states like Florida, where more than 200,000 people voted for independent candidates such as Gary Johnson or Jill Stein. If you distrust something, you are more likely to opt out of it, said Rashawn Ray, a governance fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Sanders supporters don't trust the Democratic Party. They think it's political sabotage and not allowing Bernie to have a fair shot. So what do people do? They opt out. Ray also said voter suppression is alive and well and probably affected turnout for Sanders, but he said that the group that is more likely to determine the election is the 11% of white voters, mostly suburban and often women, who switched from Barack Obama in 2012 to Trump in the last election. So let's have a little chat with the 11% of white voters. Let's let them know the swing voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania will make sure they can't have Biden. So if you really want to defeat Donald Trump, you need to get behind Bernie. Here's a Medium article by Justin Ward called "There's Still a Case for Bernie or Bust." A Biden nomination would repeat a losing formula that will certainly hand Donald Trump another term. The Democratic primary's crowded field has finally winnowed. At the peak, more than 24 candidates were vying for the nomination, but with the pre-Super Tuesday consolidation of moderates behind Joe Biden, it's now a two-way race. The two options are Bernie or bust. Voters face a choice. We can repeat a losing formula, nominate an establishment-minded veteran that will certainly hand Donald Trump another term, or we can pin our hopes on the unprecedented grassroots movement that has coalesced around Senator Bernie Sanders, even in spite of his lackluster showing in the Democratic primary. For decades now, the reigning conventional wisdom has been that the American people are afraid of change. We are made to believe that the path to the promised land is gradualism, going nowhere and getting there in increments. That was pretty good. Going nowhere and getting there in increments. The movement is never right to rock the boat. Now is not the time, and now will never be the time. Populism is a dirty word. We're told time and again that the moderate candidate is always the safest. Biden is the ultimate repudiation of this thesis. Sanders' critics love to tell him, politics requires addition, not subtraction. The Vermont senator has hit a ceiling, his detractors claim, and can't expand his base beyond his dedicated cadre of supporters. Well, let's do the math on Biden. Take Hillary Clinton's liabilities as a candidate and add about a dozen more, then subtract her appeal as the potential first woman president and ability to express herself clearly. Trump is no political genius, but he does have a sort of crude cunning that has proven effective in the past. He's also shameless and utterly immune to charges of hypocrisy. In 2016, he attacked Clinton from the left on many issues, such as the Iraq War and Wall Street corruption. Trump needs an establishment foil to run against. It's central to his political identity. In that regard, Biden is a target-rich environment. He'll be called out over his support for the war on terror and NAFTA, his past efforts to cut Social Security, and his son's involvement with the Ukrainian gas company Burisma. Trump will use his one major bipartisan legislative achievement, the First Step Act, to posture as a champion of prison reform while casting Biden as the villain behind the epidemic of mass incarceration. There's also Biden's well-known ties to Delaware-based credit card companies, which earned him the nickname the Senator from NBNA. Trump may have rooted for a Sanders victory, but what he really needs is an establishment foil to run against. It's central to his political identity, and Biden fits the role of the venal insider even better than Clinton. Biden is also remarkably mistake-prone. Clinton never forgot Obama's name or the words to the Declaration of Independence while on the campaign trail. She never got irate with an immigration activist at a town hall and told him, "You should vote for Trump." Clinton's campaign didn't limit her schedule to reduce the potential for gaffes, which seemed to occur more often later in the day, as The Hill noted of Biden last fall. While most of the centrist media whistles past the graveyard, Trump and the right are running wild with attacks on Biden's mental state. During a 7-minute speech in Missouri on Saturday, Biden made another gaffe in which he said, "We can only re-elect Donald Trump." Trump pounced on it, tweeting, "I agree with Joe." Biden is an awful candidate. He's like a turducken of all the presidential losers of the past 2 decades. Biden has as much baggage as Clinton, and he's every bit as uninspiring as Al Gore or John Kerry. Barack Obama, the only candidate to buck this pattern, was a charismatic young contender who ran on a platform of hope and transformation. Biden's promise, which he delivered to an audience of rich donors last summer, is that nothing will fundamentally change. Nevertheless, I am also grateful for Biden because his candidacy lays it all bare. Any discussion of the establishment by Sanders or his campaign is dismissed as conspiratorial, but a candidate so obviously unfit as Biden could not have gotten this far without the concerted effort of a powerful political machine. Biden's status as the frontrunner not only demonstrates the establishment's power, but also its willingness to sacrifice our future to preserve it. Addition, not subtraction, only goes in one direction. The left must always be absorbed by the center, not the other way around. But the Democrats cannot win just by recreating the Clinton coalition under a lesser candidate. Everyone understands this, but party elites are willing to risk everything because they prefer humiliating defeat to a takeover by an insurgent progressive movement. Biden subtracts so much and adds so little. He can't excite his own small base, much less bring in new voters. Sanders' campaign actually adds something. The working class vote is chronically depressed by the lack of politicians who give voice to the needs of ordinary people. In 2016, voters who make less than $50,000 a year accounted for only 34% of the electorate, down from 41% in 2012. Sanders' platform speaks to the nearly 2/3 of Americans who can't afford a $500 emergency room visit and the 84 million who are uninsured or underinsured. More than 110 million sat out the last election, and the majority came from economically marginalized groups. If the Democrats could consistently mobilize just a small fraction of these people, they would never lose an election again. Campaign contribution data testifies to Sanders' massive support from the working poor, who are willing to give not only their votes but also a portion of their meager incomes to help him win. According to an analysis of fundraising data provided by Act Blue, an online fundraising platform tied to the Democratic Party, Sanders leads among all categories of blue-collar workers. His top donors include bartenders, meat cutters, teachers, and fast food workers. Sanders also gets more donations from active duty military than any politician, including Trump. His people-funded campaign continues to shatter records. In February alone, he raised $46.5 million, which is more than Biden took in during the entire last half of 2019. Even with billionaire bundlers and top Democratic fundraisers, Biden was getting beat nearly 2-1. Now that moderates are coalescing around him, Biden is only just starting to make up ground. This is more than just dollars. The proportion of small donors is a good metric of grassroots excitement. In 2016, 69% of Trump's contributions were small donors versus 22% of Clinton's. With an average donation of $18, Sanders can match Trump in that regard. Biden can't. Enthusiasm will be crucial in overcoming the inevitable obstacle of voter suppression. We got a taste of that on Super Tuesday as students at universities in California and Texas were forced to wait upward of 7 hours. They were overwhelmingly Sanders supporters. It's hard to imagine that many youth standing in line for Biden on Election Day, given that he made it perfectly clear he has no empathy for the problems they face. His response to the suggestion that young people might be struggling? Give me a break. It's not only our votes the Democratic establishment should worry about, it's our labor. When Bernie's youth turnout failed to live up to expectations, his opponents scoffed, "So much for the revolution." The cynicism is stunning. Putting aside the fact that youth and Latino turnout actually did play a huge role in some of Sanders' bigger wins, the bigger headline should be that all those feckless youngsters every boomer complains about were excited and engaged enough to endure that farce at the polls. Come November, if Biden is the nominee, a significant chunk of the electorate will stay home. According to one poll, only about half of Sanders supporters have committed to vote blue no matter who. But it's not our votes the establishment should worry about, it's our labor. Absolute mensch that he is, Sanders will endorse and stump for Biden if he wins. His movement is a different story. The Sanders campaign has more than 1 million volunteers doing canvassing, phone banking, and texting. For reference, Amazon has 750,000 employees. The Democratic National Committee will have to make up for that incalculable loss of free workforce with professional organizers. They will have less money to pay. We will not give our time or our money to a candidate who doesn't represent us or a party that regards us as a nuisance. So here is the choice before us: an energized grassroots movement or the shambling husk of a dying party. A campaign powered by people and ideas or one fueled by mega donors and self-interest. A passionate million-strong volunteer army or a bunch of dead-eyed non-union mercenaries hired off Craigslist. A new kind of politics or the status quo. Victory or defeat. Bernie or bust. Get on board the Bernie or bust train. Come get on board the Bernie or bust train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernie or bust train. The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.